Hello again, it's Dr. Robert Guthrie, and we're proceeding on with our studies of the Old Testament. And we're at an interesting point where there's been a debate for a long time about the Hebrew or Israelite conquest of the Holy Land. And the debate takes two forms. One is, when was it? Some people think it didn't exist at all. I personally think it did. When was it, and how did it happen? And so we'll discuss the when was it first, and then we'll discuss toward the end the three different hypotheses, theories, whatever you want to say, as to how it happened. So the first one, there's always been a significant debate about when this happened and did it happen. And a lot of the debate, I think, was really fueled by the when did it happen. Because the traditional date for the Exodus is about 1250 BC. This is when Ramses II, Ramses the Great, was king, and he was building a capital in the eastern Nile Delta so he could keep a better eye on their empire along the coastal part of the Middle East, the area where the Philistines were and up where Lebanon is now. And so that would match up to the Hebrews building this thing in the eastern delta. Well, the problem with that assumption is they had always been building things in the eastern delta over hundreds and hundreds of years, so it's not a definitive thing. And the problem with the Exodus being in 1250 is that would put their arrival. Remember, they spent 40 years at Kadesh Barnea, letting the old slave people die off, and their children, who had become tough desert warriors, take over, so they could get tough enough to conquer the land. So that would have put the actual entry to about 1200. There's a couple problems with that from my perspective. One is the archaeology doesn't support it. There's not a lot of archaeology showing the conquest of destroyed cities like the biblical account has in the 1200 range. And second is that's only 200 years from King David at the height of the United Monarchy. And that's not enough time for this small band of desert wanderers to get large enough that they could establish this middle-sized kingdom based at Jerusalem. Because remember, when we talked about Sinai, that the south central part of Sinai, around where the traditional Mount Sinai is, can support about 10,000 people in modern times. They're grazing and they know how to tap the water supplies and all that. Well, if they could support 10,000 people now in the modern era with much better techniques for digging wells and all that, they probably could support at most 10,000 people thousands of years ago. So maybe even less than that. So it could have been as few as 5,000 people escaping and leaving and end up in Kadesh Barnea. It could have been 10,000. But of that 10,000, only about 25% are going to be fighting men. You'll have a lot of children, you'll have women, you'll have older people. So 5,000 people at the most, that'd be, even 3,000 people. That's not a lot of people to go capturing these various fortified cities. And then that small group, if they had settled at 10,000 people in the Central Highlands, could that have had enough population growth to have the mid-sized kingdom that King David had? No. Even though they didn't have any contraception or anything like that, they had a very high infant mortality rate, probably about 50%, and no protection against infection. You got pneumonia in those days, 30 or 40% of you died. So I don't think that's enough time to have had the population growth necessary to get to David's size of kingdom. He conquered a lot of the neighboring kingdoms only 200 years later. So there's a real problem with that. And the solution is maybe that date's wrong. There's no clear evidence of it other than the scriptural account, which says that this happened at 480 years after the Hebrews had arrived in Egypt. That date is written down about 500 BC, 700 or 800 years after it happened, even more than that. And so it's more than a hypothesis. If you look in 1 Kings, when you get into the Kings account, they have a lot of more contemporaneous accounting by, clearly David had a court historian that had a lot of the court records. They were written down at the same time. at the time this was actually happening. So in 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1, it says that Solomon's temple was timed. It was built in the fourth year of his reign, which would make it, I got it right here, 967 BC. And that account says that the Exodus was 480 years before that, which put the Exodus back to 1450. Totally different. 200 years farther back. So they would arrive at the Holy Land as conquerors, as attackers, at 1400. Well, does the archaeology show destruction of certain cities at 1400? Yes, it does. And that also, after you do conquering and settling and all that, in my opinion, this is an all opinion here, okay? I know I say these things. One of my work colleagues years ago used to say to me, not often right, but always adamant. I think I'm right here, but certainly, so this is not fact, this is opinion. But that gives them enough time to have population growth enough to take over the whole area and have this mid-sized kingdom 400 years later under King David. Because like we said, population growth was not rapid. You had bad harvest, people would starve, you had disease, you had warfare, you got wounded in battle, you died of tetanus, et cetera, et cetera. So if you put the entry into the Holy Land at 1400 BC with an Exodus at 50 years before at 1450, that times in better. And so there are several destroyed cities that they have been able to find, and the first is Jericho. Now, conquest of Jericho is a great account. It's everyone's favorite account, and the walls came tumbling down. Now, does this story have some sense to it? Yes, and what did the archaeology show? It didn't show, archaeology doesn't prove anything. Archaeology suggests, and much of it is up to the interpretation of the archaeologist, so there's a lot of opinion in here. But Jericho was dug up several times, and the last time was in the 1950s by Kathleen Kenyon, an English lady who was one of the early scientific excavators, that she mapped out basically they dig trenches. And she mapped out her trenches well, and she did her layers well, and she identified them, and she kept meticulous records. But she was a skeptic. She didn't think this was going to show anything. And because a lot of archaeology is interpretation, you always bring your bias with you. And so she said she didn't find anything there to suggest that kind of conquest. But she based it on one thing, which was the absence of imported bichrome ware, two-color black and red porcelain china, not porcelain, black and red glazed china from Cyprus. Well, this would be expensive imported china, and Jericho then, as now, is a backwater. And so the absence of this didn't prove anything. As we say scientifically, the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It's just nothing. But so she recorded all her thing in her detailed notes, never did a final report. This is the curse of Palestinian archaeology, if people don't write final reports, and then she died. And so her report sat unevaluated until 1990, and her assumption that there was nothing there to support the conquest of Jericho was just taken as gospel, even though it was just, like I am, opinion. 1990, a student who's finishing his PhD in Holy Land pottery goes back through her notes and looks through her notes. She took meticulous records. And he said, wait a minute, she's got it backwards. The first is, I'll show you how they do pottery. Pottery dating is the key of archaeological in the Eastern Mediterranean area, because the styles of pottery, the types of bowls and plates you make, and the decoration change over time, every 30, 40, 50 years. And so the eras are based on the changes in the pottery. I'm going to hold this up. Maybe you all can see. This is an example from his article in 1990, Biblical Archaeology Review, which shows the various, can you see that, Eric? Okay. And you can see the various types of pottery. So they could date these, because these pottery things change over time. And they can say, they get what 40 or 50 year ranges of when these types of things were made, and they all get broken, and they get thrown in the trash heaps, or they're found in the ruins, etc. So that's how they date everything, is off of pottery. And he looks at the pottery and says, this does date to about 1400. And then he goes back through her notes, and he finds that in a strange way, her notes support the biblical account. Because if you remember your biblical account, whether you did the reading or not, they crossed the Jordan on dry land. Basically, they went out into the river, and the water stopped, and then they crossed on dry land and put a memorial and went up to the city to attack it. It's only about 5-6 miles. Does the Jordan stop flowing at times? Yeah, about 3 times in recorded history, there have been earthquakes, which had caused landslides, which dammed the Jordan River up. It's not that wide or that fast a current for about 24, 36 hours or so, and then the water backs up and overwhelms this earthen check dam that naturally occurred, and then it starts flowing again. Do you get a lot of earthquakes in this area? You sure do. Why? Because geologically, this is what's called a rift valley. If you're familiar with plate tectonics, we now understand that there's a bunch of different large plates making up the continents and the seabeds, and they're moving slightly per year, a few centimeters, a centimeter or two a year. And the Rift Valley comes down through Turkey, and it's the Jordan River, and it's the Dead Sea, which is the lowest spot on Earth, and it goes under the Red Sea down to Kenya to Olduvai Gorge, where it's separating down there also. And that's why they can find all those early fossils in Olduvai Gorge, because the land is separating and they can get deep without having to just dig. They can just walk along the surface. So what you've got there at Jericho is these 2 plates are moving apart. So you get a lot of earthquakes. So it's actually an earthquake zone. And so they go across, they have their ceremony, they come up, and they come up to Jericho, and the walls are down. How are the walls down? Now, this is a tricky one. We'll try to do this too. What you had at Jericho is you had a base that raised the city up, and this was a raised mound, and they had heavy rocks around, kind of as a revetment, a base wall underneath that, and on top of that you had the real walls, which were mud brick, adobe as we call it here. And so when you give the mud brick a good hard shake, remember they didn't have any steel or other types of things anchoring the buildings with like we use now. This is like if you have a garage that's built out of cinder block without any support, and you get a really good hard shake, it's going to crack and fall over. So what Kenyon's exhibit digging had shown was the mud brick walls had cracked in an earthquake and had fallen out. So when they fall out, the mud brick that's fallen out becomes a causeway. So you could run up the causeway through the walls and into the city. Kaboom. And here's a picture of it, of his drawing of it, or her drawing of it. Have we got that, Eric? Okay. And so what happens most likely, and you may have got to take the romance out of the story, is they come up, the river's dry, they scamper across, go up to Jericho, the wall is down, they go charging in and kill everybody. What did they find? They didn't take the city by siege. How do you know that? Because when Kenyon got into the storage jars that store the food were full of grain. So in a siege where the people collapse, all the food's eaten up before they go. And the storage jars were not, so they had all this grain there, and it wasn't plundered. Aha! If you read the account, the Hebrews were not allowed to plunder Jericho. The one guy who got caught stealing things got killed. And so in a strange way, it matches the account. My guess is they probably paraded around the city afterwards, blew their trumpets to celebrate the Lord's hand and guiding them, and they went on, into the highlands to settle. So this is my assessment based on the archaeology. And this is becoming more accepted. People now understand that this has become the accepted story of Jericho. So I do think what happened, the Lord kind of jiggled the earth crust, got them their earthquake. Very typical in that area to have earthquakes. The river's dry for a day or two. They scamper across. There's only 5,000 or 10,000 of them. Go up to the city. The walls have fallen out, and there's this walk, and in they go. They kill everybody, capture the city, and move about. So that's my assessment of it. Am I right? I think so. Could I be wrong? Sure, I can always be wrong. So that's an excellent explanation that actually matches up to the story. Do you have other cities in this time frame that were captured and destroyed? Yeah, you got a couple that they've been able to identify. One is Hazor, which is to the north. There's an account in the latter part of Joshua. Because it's an interesting question, how would they take these cities? It's an interesting question. I don't really know. Siege technology, remember, this is the Bronze Age. They had no explosives, no aircraft. You had bronze weapons, spears, bows and arrows, and that's all they had. So most of the time you would take a city by a siege, where you'd surround them and starve them out. And sometimes they'd get desperate and come out and attack and other things like that. The account on Hazor, which is in the latter part of Joshua 8, 9, 10 that we didn't have you read, they have them lure them out with what I call the crazy horse. If you're familiar with American history, in 1866, Crazy Horse lured some people of the U.S. Army up over the ridge. He runs around and gets them to chase him, and they chase him into an ambush. Indians are waiting there. They massacre him. The Fetterman Massacre, it's called, if you're familiar with American history against the natives. And the account for capturing Ai is that they do that. They come up, fake an attack, pull back, and they charge out of the fort to chase them and get massacred. That's possible. It's really hard to take these other than some other fashion because they didn't have time probably to besiege them. They might have besieged some of the cities. Did they have the fancy technology to force their way in? Siege machines, battering rams, siege towers. They probably didn't. They probably didn't know how to build those. They probably didn't have the lumber to build the big heavy siege towers and all that. So it's it's unclear how they did it, but they did do it to a certain fashion. So they were able to conquer certain of these cities. This is the first. So at this point, we're going to refresh what I'd said before, that there are three hypotheses. Hypothesis is the medical term, scientific term, for an assumption, a guess. Three hypotheses to explain how they could have conquered the Holy Land. The first one is the direct assault hypothesis, which is what's in Joshua, particularly the first 12 or 13 chapters of Joshua. They have them coming in and take Jericho, then they go and take the southern part of the highlands, then they go and take the northern part of the highlands, and everything's fine. And they even have them capturing Jerusalem, which they didn't capture. And there's probably some truth to that, because they did capture, appears that someone at that time captured Jericho, someone captured Hazor, someone captured Ai. So that probably happened somewhat. The second one is what's called the gradual infiltration theory. And if you read the first 3.5 chapters of Judges, it's very different. The account there has them coming in and moving in to the relatively empty area. Remember, God had provided them a relatively empty highlands, and the city-states that had been there had gotten weakened when the Egyptians threw the Hyksos out. They came charging up the coast of Canaan, and they weakened a lot of the city-states, so they were vulnerable to being captured by the Hebrews when they got there. And they have them moving in amongst the other people, taking over and lording it over them, but living among them. And so it's what they call the gradual infiltration. A lot of the areas were probably empty. These people come in, they start to settle. Now this makes them very vulnerable to corruption, because when they ask the locals, well, how do you plant these crops? They would tell you, you plant them this way and you do this, and you go over to the Baal temple where you have the graven image of the storm god Baal, and you make your sacrifices to Baal and to Ashtart, and they'll give you fertility. And you go, oh, okay. And this is the war with the fertility gods that goes on until the Babylonian conquest in about 580, 590 BC. But there's probably a lot of that happened, because they don't destroy all these areas. They move in amongst them, and a lot of these areas were relatively empty. So this is probably quite logical also. So you've got these two hypotheses, both of which appear to be valid. Some conquest, a lot of infiltration. The infiltration was, they didn't kill all the natives. They adopted them, they married into their families, et cetera, and that got the corruption going. Turned out I called it a 700-year war. If I move the Exodus back 200 years, it's a 900-year war with the Baals. Okay, well that's interesting. And the third one is called the Peasant Rebellion. It's an odd hypothesis that pops up in the mid 20th century, 1930, 1950, somewhere in there. And some person says there really wasn't any Exodus at all. None of this happened. There wasn't any conquest. This is the person's argument, that what this was a peasant rebellion against the repression of their overlords by the peasantry. Now, this is kind of a Marxist theory, really, what it is. And it was popular back in the mid 20th century when Marxism was more popular. And is there any evidence that some of this may have happened? Sure. Because if you'd done your reading, which you don't have to, get into Joshua 24. You have a very famous soliloquy by Joshua. He has a meeting at Shechem. Shechem is the traditional meeting place for the tribes. Remember, after the capture of the land, the tribes all spread out, and each of the 12 tribes has their own individual area. 3 of the tribes are on the east side of the Jordan, the rest are on the west. The largest tribe is Judah. They end up in the area around Jerusalem. But in Shechem is what became the northern kingdom, and this is the central meeting place where the tribes would gather for conclaves and stuff like that. And they have a ceremony there. And it's, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one God, and this is our God. And if you pay attention to that, and the earlier thing about having a treaty with the Gibeonites, it's quite possible that the conquering Israelites came in and offered the new faith to some of their cousin tribes who were already living there and were now under the domination of the Hebrews. And that would explain why they're having this ceremony, to say, okay, here we are, you can join us rather than fight us and become part of us, but you've got to accept the new faith. So people may have accepted it eagerly, people may have accepted it unwillingly, but reluctantly is a better term. And again, that would lead to more of the battle with corruption. So my own opinion is that all 3 of these things happened. There was some conquest, clearly at Jericho, clearly at Ai, clearly at Hazor. There was clear infiltration, as in the first 3 chapters of Judges, where they talked about where they could go and where they couldn't go. They couldn't get down on the coastal plain because the people on the coastal plain had iron chariots that the Egyptians had provided. They couldn't capture Megiddo. I've been to Megiddo. It's tough. It's really high. Couldn't capture Jerusalem. Took the Romans 3 years to capture Jerusalem. Really tough to capture Jerusalem. And so they put down what they couldn't capture, and they listed the places that they could. So they clearly had some infiltration into the empty areas. They probably did bring some of the local tribes into the new faith. So you probably had all 3 things coming into play. And moving the timing back to 1400 means that about by 1300, when the whole Eastern Mediterranean world starts to collapse, remember about 1250, a couple of weeks ago, we talked about there's a total dissolution of all the empires in the Middle East. God provides them a chance to coalesce into a nation to become the kingdom of David and Solomon, because all the Middle Eastern kingdoms collapsed. The Greek Mycenaean states at Mycenae and Pylos and Knossos and all these places, they collapse and the cities disappear. Hittite Empire just goes poof and it's gone. And these sea peoples, these raiders, go out through the Mediterranean raiding in their ships. Only the Egyptians could beat them, but they drove the Egyptians back out of Middle East and they had to retreat back to Egypt. And the Philistines, who were part of these sea peoples, who were these Greek raiders, probably the fighting aristocracy of the Mycenaean kingdoms, when they fell apart, they took to the sea and became the sea people. They settled and become the Philistines. So you had this series of events where it had set the framework and gave them the situation where they could make this conquest and settle in, and then gave them a couple hundred years where they could grow from these bands of probably 10,000 people arriving at Jericho into the several hundreds of thousands that they needed to have the kingdom of David, for first King Saul, then King David, then Solomon, and the divided kingdom. So it's a very complicated story, but I think the 3 different hypotheses, that all of them were somewhat true, and then together they became, the individual parts came together to to much greater than either of the theories would be alone. So the sum of the three was greater than the individual parts. Now, I'm going to stop there. I hope you all enjoy my enthusiasm for this. I think it's a fascinating story, and I love it. It shows the Lord works in mysterious ways. The reading for next week, if you want to do it, we'll do Judges. You don't have to do it. I'll talk about it. Judges 4-5 is a story of Deborah. These are great legendary stories. A lot of romance in some of these, excitement and all that. Judges 6-8 is Gideon, Gideon's trumpet and all that. And then Samson is chapters 13-16. Samson gets more legendary as we go along. This is Dr. Guthrie. Thank you very much. I'll see you in a week.